Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, the new editor of The Books Desk, and for the next many months, we'll be highlighting great conversations from our decade-plus archive. We're planning a new iteration of this podcast, and as a result, we're going to take a while to figure out what that might sound like. Until then, we hope you enjoy these trips down memory lane. Jann Wenner, the former editor of Rolling Stone magazine, has just released a memoir titled, not surprisingly perhaps, Like a Rolling Stone. This seemed like a great moment to revisit a conversation from December 2017 when Pamela Paul and John Williams interviewed the journalist Joe Hagan upon the release of his Wenner biography, Sticky Fingers. And in keeping with the autobiography and memoir theme, we also have a lengthy roundtable recorded in July 2019 in which Pamela and John spoke to three of our book critics about what was then our newly published list of the best memoirs of the past 50 years.
Joe Hagan is here now to talk about his new book, Sticky Fingers, The Life and Times of Jann Wenner and Rolling Stone magazine. And also joining us, my colleague, John Williams. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right. So how did you get involved in this project?
Well, a few years ago, I left the city and moved upstate into the Hudson Valley region of New York. And one day I was working in a local cafe on my laptop, and in walks Jann Wenner, who I recognized immediately and was perplexed as to what he was doing there. So I just went up and said hello to him and said, "Hey, Jann Wenner, what are you doing in Little Tivoli, New York?"
Right. And were you like a lifelong Rolling Stone reader, Jann Wenner fan?
Well, Rolling Stone, yes. First of all, I was a huge rock and roll fan, just a huge music fan. And I had interned at Rolling Stone. In fact, I moved to New York in 1995 to intern at Rolling Stone. And later, as a media reporter, I had an audience with Jann to chat with him. And he, dropped his names as he does about Mick Jagger and all this. But so I didn't really know him, but here I was talking to him. After I got to know him socially for about a year, the subject of doing his biography came up during a lunch that we had. And that's how the whole adventure began.
No, but you were not the first person to contemplate doing a biography.
No. There'd been one attempt that lasted 5 years that had a contract. Louis McAdams was the guy's name. He was somebody that Jann knew from San Francisco in the 60s. Who had published poetry in Rolling Stone. So that happened. Then Rich Cohen.
But what happened with that book? Did Jann, was it authorized? Did Jann back out from cooperating?
Jann had control of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the guy had the contract, but Jann was heavily involved in partitioning out the research and controlling it. And it imploded for a lot of different reasons. One, the guy became, I think, overwhelmed by the job and his own personal life kind of collapsed. And then the controlling nature that Jann had put on it, I don't think was helping the situation. Mm-hmm. And it just basically fell apart. And then the second one didn't get even hardly out the door, really. I mean, Rich Cohen got a contract to do the book, and then Jann canceled it when he read the book proposal.
So you knew that you were going into perhaps a situation that might be difficult.
Absolutely. In fact, I tried to do a lot of due diligence before I got involved in it because of those past things, including trying to talk to Rich, who sort of gave me the chapter and verse on how his attempt went. And I realized this has to be independent, period. And I have to get it in writing. At first, Jann tried to exert too much control right off the bat after he asked me to do it. And I told him no.
So in what way? Was it like in terms of contractual things, like I need to see the pages before? Or was it controlling who you spoke to? Or
he wanted to control the subject matter of his sexual history.
And that specifically?
Yeah, and that was the specific thing. And I balked at that. But we got to a point where we began to negotiate, where it was really lawyers and a piece of paper. Like we have to get into a contract of like what this would mean, how it would be shaped,
right.
the relationship.
So knowing that Jann Wenner was a kind of difficult figure of these previous sort of attempts and the legal situation, what was the attraction to you to tell this particular story?
Well, I'm a huge fan. I subscribed to Rolling Stone growing up in high school. And I knew that because the story was sitting there,
right,
and that nobody had been able to get to it, that it must be a lot there. You know, just intuitively, as a reporter, you're thinking there must be a rich thing. And when I learned that his archive had 500 boxes, that it was this incredibly well-maintained, organized thing, and I thought, well, there must be a lot of amazing stuff in there. Imagine the history. And then I got a look at some of it when I said, let me dig up all the John Lennon stuff and look through it. And it was extraordinary.
Did you have full access to that archive?
I did. Carte blanche, really. And it was searchable, where you could search for certain subjects and it would show you the boxes that had material relating to that person or subject. And so I was really able to focus my research around, even though it was huge number of boxes, I was able to focus the research, and it was extraordinary stuff.
So we know that since the book's been published, Wenner has, voiced some of these things have come to pass where he hasn't been happy with some of the tone, especially around his sexual history. But I wonder if during the process of writing the book, did any of that tension come out then, or is it all sort of a post-publication?
It was throughout for me.
That must have been difficult.
It was. It was like almost having to manage his expectations and then also kind of constantly be aware of this elephant in the room, which is that he wants to maintain a certain level of control, and I know I have to get the story while also managing my relationship with him. So there was a lot there. And it was nerve-wracking, frankly. But what helped me get through it was I made a decision really at the outset that I was going to be honest with him and always be frank with him. And if I came across difficult material, I was just going to, address it with him. So in that way, it kind of let some of the pressure off. And by the end, we reached a point where I really tried to present him with the most radioactive material and make him aware of what I knew so he wouldn't be surprised.
So you look at a book like this, and from the outside, you could say it's a book about music, it's a book about the media, it's a book about power, it's a book about that period, which is 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, now about sex and obviously drugs. Like, how did you see the story?
Well, it evolved. I mean, at first I thought, it'll be a bunch of rock and roll stories. But then I began to realize that it was much, much richer than that. And at first I was a little nervous about it. I was like, there's all these ancillary characters that people have never heard of, but who turned out to be really important. And I started to say, well, you know what? It has to be about that. I have to follow the story where it's going. And what it turned out to be was this kind of rich cultural history that was the soap opera of of Jann and this circle of people that he knew, many of whom were famous, some of whom were not. And that if I connected it all and told it well, that it would be, bigger than just a bunch of rock and roll stories.
One of the things that's been called out for praise, I think, in almost every review, and the book came out now a month ago?
Late October. Yeah.
Late October. So we've got lots of reviews in. It's getting a great amount of attention. Of course, Jack Schaefer reviews it this week in the book review. But everyone seems to mention the fact that this could have been a very name-droppy book. And you said earlier that Jann himself is a very name-droppy person, but that it wasn't, and that you were very restrained. When Art Garfunkel comes in, it's because, he needs to be there or whoever it might be. Was that a deliberate decision?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I wasn't overawed by these people. But I also realized that if you stripped away just the sort of de facto reverence that, we're supposed to have for rock stars, this was just a story of a bunch of young people acting up and trying to make their way in the world.
Right.
And that the closer I made it down to the human scale, the more successful the book would be. This occurred to me in the process of writing it, really.
My big picture question about Wenner, especially in the, let's say, first 50 or 60 pages of the book, I get the sense of him as an almost Nixonian character where he's in this boarding school and he's writing the kind of gossip columns to get back at the kids who are more popular than him. And he never seems to me at all cool. And yet the magazine very effortlessly kind of defined and created all of these things that were very cool. Sure. And how do you explain that juxtaposition?
Well, I mean, have you ever met a high school newspaper editor? They're not like
the super dorks.
They're not like the coolest people in the school. But they have a feeling of that they could be, and the proximity to what is going on gives them a lot of energy and gives them satisfaction. Jann's story is of a guy who's sort of like constantly kind of pressed against the glass because he wants to be close to what is cool, what's going on, who's sexy, who's hip, who's beautiful. He wants to be around those people.
I guess the sub-question there then, though, is that do you think he has or had good taste? Or do you think he was just good at letting people do their thing?
Well, he recognized people who had good taste, and he brought them into his orbit. And number one was his wife, Jann Wenner, who was really the tastemaker in their life, and who also had good judgment about who had good taste and who was good. And Jann had just raw ambition. He could pick out great writers, not necessarily because he had such literary pretensions for what was good writing, but he recognized people who had ambition, people who had like just incredible intent and wanted to be in his pages.
Was that attractive to him? Ambition in himself and in other people?
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of, well, not kind of, it is one of the things that the title is about. The title, in addition to being a reference to a Rolling Stones album and, sex and greed and all these other things that it has to do with, is about ambition. Jann had incredible ambition. The people he had around him were ambitious. I mean, look at the people that became part of his sort of central orbit, almost comedically so in recent years. Bono, Bruce Springsteen, Mick Jagger. They're not just artists, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They're institutions, they're businessmen. They understand what they're creating and building. And Jann liked that, and they recognized in Jann a partner in who could help them.
What do you think, after having written this, led to the great success of Rolling Stone? I mean, was it attributable to Jann himself? Was it the moment? Was it the people around him?
Well, initially, it was definitely that Jann had more ambition and energy than anybody around him in San Francisco, California in 1967. I mean, what he did was not very hippie-like. At the height of the Summer of Love and the Haight-Ashbury, here's a guy who's wearing, as you can see on the cover, a blue Oxford button-down that was probably from Brooks Brothers, who was able to kind of keep his eye on the ball and work intensely hard and assemble it and bring people together and make it happen. Well, that's like, 90% of it, right? And his timing could not have been better, and he was the guy to do it. He had one foot in of that world and one foot out in a kind of classic way, which made him also a journalist, really. Too.
How did he have one foot in, one foot out?
Well, he wasn't
Where
a hippie. He was
from?
not really, he was a preppy. He was a social climber. He was not somebody who was in San Francisco looking for spiritual enlightenment. You know what I mean? He was already from there, and he had followed a path to it by following all the kind of like wealthy children of privilege who were also migrating into this world. And he followed them there. And he recognized, oh, this is the new thing. And the rock and roll, I love it. It's great. And it is an expression. And Jann got this. This was his vision. It wasn't just a bunch of rock bands. It was the expression of this generation's sense of their own power, that this was the new paradigm, and that this could be a vehicle to the future, that rock and roll was not, as he writes in the first issue, it's not just about the music, it's about the things and the attitudes that the music embraces. And he recognized that that was basically the generation saying to themselves, we're going to take over.
Mm-hmm.
There's more of us than there's ever been. We're the smartest, most educated. There's, as Tom Wolfe said, first time that kids had money, right?
Is that what you think made Rolling Stone as a magazine work, that it transcended the music, that it was also
Absolutely.
A culture, that was where Bonfire of the Vanities was serialized, the right stuff?
Well, listen, these two things went together. One, you had the rock stars who had pretensions to want to be known as artists.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to see themselves as having credibility. They wanted to be revered. They wanted to be respected. And the way to do that, and Jann saw this, and this was his brilliant move, was to attach to that politics and social observation and all the things you would associate with mainstream magazines, but making rock have that cultural credibility. And so that was a formula that said, basically, the rock and roll generation has as much right to be at the center of the conversation as anybody else.
And now we're at a time, obviously, where for many years people have said that, rock is dead, even though I'm sure you and I still listen to it. But
Sure.
Do you have a sense for yourself of when the magazine's kind of golden age ended, or when its influence started to wane in some important ways?
Well, this has been argued since, time immemorial. I mean, even some people thought it ended in the 70s. And early in the 70s.
For us, like children of the 80s, that couldn't possibly be true.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I actually came up with MTV and Rolling Stone. I had a subscription to, but I really read it to read about people I saw on MTV, So I came from a slightly different angle. But I remember like in the 90s when I sort of myself reverted to spin. And you'd read that, and then there were bands like Pavement, who were like a big band of the 90s, who were singing, goodbye to the rock and roll era. It was kind of over. We all ironically thought of rock as something that it had outlived its pretensions, if that makes sense. And so,
was it like grunge and then also hip hop?
Yeah, and just everything kind of sort of the sense of rock leading us into something good sort of ended, And after that, it became, along with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a kind of institutional idea of recycling for financial gain, frankly, you know, box sets and repackaging and on and on and on.
How cynical do you think that is? Do you think that Wenner has maintained, after all these years, his own sort of belief in the power of that culture-making vehicle, or no?
Well, listen, as the book kind of tries to illuminate, he's a kind of walking contradiction. If you saw Jann Wenner at a Bruce Springsteen concert, he would be jumping up and down. He has that kind of like guilelessness to him on the one hand. On the other hand, he's an opportunist. And they can go together, those two things, and they did with him.
You mentioned, John, the death of rock and roll. Obviously, it's also an era in which we're contemplating, if not the death, certainly the waning of magazines. And it's interesting that this book is coming out at the same time that a number of big books about magazines are coming out and things going on in the magazine industry. You had Tina Brown's Vanity Fair Diaries. New York Magazine just had a huge coffee table 50-year anniversary. At the same time that many magazines, Rolling Stone is up for sale. A number of big editors have recently left Condé Nast magazines and magazines at Hearst. So did you think about that timing in terms of when the book was coming out? Obviously, couldn't have known that it was going to come out at this
No, but just by
moment.
having written it, I kind of intuited where we were. Because here I had followed decade by decade this man who was really at the center of a lot of zeitgeists over the years. And I knew it also just from being in the business that the magazine world was declining. The music business had already basically kind of reformatted itself as something lesser.
Right.
And, culturally anyway, in terms of its centrality to the culture. And it's interesting you say that because it's magazines, yes, it's music, but it's also the whole culture of the baby boomers has arrived to this reckoning that we're in right now.
Yes, other reckonings going on
generationally. And this book kind of, it does talk about that at the end. It talks about how the kind of, the narrative of the 60s had basically played itself out and kind of lost the thread, And now here we are with the new generation that's basically calling this other generation out onto the mat, gender-wise and every other way, and saying, here are the ways you failed. I didn't intend that to happen, but the Jann Wenner story just seemed to kind of logically fit into that.
Well, that's a very melancholy way to end what should be a bright segment about a book that's getting a lot of praise. The book, again, is Sticky Fingers, The Life and Times of Jann Wenner and Rolling Stone Magazine by Joe Hagan. Joe, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now, we have our critics, Dwight Garner, Jennifer Salai, and Parl Sagel, as well as their editor, who is known well to our listeners, John Williams. And we are going to talk about the 50 best memoirs of the last 50 years, why we did something so audacious, and just how difficult it was, and surprisingly, perhaps fun, and all the books that made it and didn't make it, and many other arguments to be had and that have already been had. So welcome, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi. All right. Let's start with the genesis of this. And maybe even before that, define what a memoir is and how you all defined that for this list. I mean, what is a memoir?
This is like, we're getting deep into
metaphysical.
it. Yeah.
I mean, we did talk about it. We debated it a little bit.
We talked about it a lot when individual books came up.
Right.
But, there would be
things,
test cases
blur.
almost that blur that line. I think we were somewhat capacious in our definition. We wanted it to be about someone's life, and we tried to shy away from things that were too much about sort of other people in their life, but there are a couple of examples of that too.
There was a famous distinction somebody made that an autobiography is about a famous person, a general, a president. And a memoir is by someone sort of lower down, a life story that isn't quite on that level. Although we have, Barack Obama's memoir on this list and other people like that. But that used to be a distinction for some people. In terms of military stories anyway, General Marshall got to write his autobiography, but a soldier wrote his memoir.
But with Obama, he wasn't famous when he wrote it.
That's true. That's a good point.
And also, I feel like there is, in an autobiography, there's not necessarily the emotional element that's emphasized. There really is the sort of events. These are the important events in an important person's life and how he or she was involved in it.
And the literary element. And I think we were looking for books that were works of art, not just this is my extreme or interesting or my life full of intensities, but something that was shaped and sculpted and was making something.
Right, not just a rolling of the credits, of someone's life.
Right. Yeah. Well, it feels like an autobiography feels like it needs to sort of start with the birth and get to the wherever you are, presumably near death, whereas memoir, although there have been people who have done the midlife or multi-volume, but whereas a memoir can just take a particular slice or look at it through a certain lens or, go very narrow in some way, like Hilary Mantel's Giving Up the Ghost, for example, is not a soup to nuts, all about me.
Yeah, one of my favorite books on here, which is A Childhood by Harry Crews, I think only covers maybe the first 5 or 6 years of his life.
Right.
At least his early childhood, at least.
Yeah, and other ones, Amal Guillermo Preto's memoir, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, Dancing with Cuba, it's just about a short time she spent in Cuba. And there's of course, flashbacks to her life, and it's a very rounded book. But, it's a short period of time, and that can work.
One of the things that comes up is sort of what are the differences between autofiction and memoir, and kind of how do you divide that?
I think we stayed away entirely from something that felt. I think there were a couple of books. I can't remember them. They're not coming straight to mind, but that were billed as fiction.
Those are Eve Babbitt's 2 memoirs. And one of the memoirs is on this list.
One of those made this list. Yeah, that's I think that kind of represents the books that are most obviously memoir, even though for some reason they're billed fiction. But I think there are a lot of cases where someone does bill something as a novel, even though it's clearly based on their life, and we tried to shy away from that.
It's too soon for the 50 best autofictions.
Way too soon.
Right. Well, actually, but the thing about autofiction is that people have been doing it since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
Post-Homeric literature is, so much of it is quote-unquote autofiction that you could do it.
I mean, we did pick a kind of artificial time constraint here with the 50 years. It's the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. It's the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. We thought we would add our own 50-year thing to the mix. But was there anything that was on the cusp that got left out that you thought, if it had just been from 1967?
Oh, you mean in terms of dates?
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't think so. I mean, I think also the interesting thing about doing the last 50 years is that, memoirs have been around like autofiction for a while, but the real energy, especially in the American memoir, has been happening within this time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in different ways and sort of different crests. And you can attach it to a different kind of book that, something like, Mary Karr's memoir or books like this that really sort of reshape what this book can do.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that people also come to reading through a lot of these books, too, they become these great popular phenomenon as well.
I think the thing we really missed in terms of the 60s were books by people like James Baldwin and Malcolm X that were landmark books and that would definitely have made the list, but that were just earlier in the 60s.
Two of them for me I missed were Stop Time, which is Frank Conroy's memoir, which is beautiful. I forget the year that it came out, but it was before 67. And the other one is a military memoir called With the Old Breed by a man named E.B. Sledge. It's one of my favorite books, and I think it came out as well in the early 60s, but it was about World War II.
There are these kind of landmarks in recent years that we think of as that's the year that memoirs became this way, or that everyone started writing memoirs. And some of them you mentioned, I think The Glass Castle and The Liars Club, and there was Catherine Harrison's The Kiss, memoirs that were somehow pivotal points in, I don't know if it's just metastasizing the number of memoirs published or making
breaking taboos, or saying that this
Yes.
too can be written about seriously and ought to be read about.
In a conversation that we published online, Jen said that something that you liked about a memoir was that sort of taboo part, that it goes there when you're not supposed to go there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, partly it's the taboo, but it's also, what Parl was saying in terms of literary qualities of the memoirs. It's the way in which it's done. It's how somebody is willing to go into an experience that he or she might not otherwise want to do. And I think that was always something that I was looking for when I was looking at the books, which is something that might seem taboo specifically to them. I mean, it might not be a cultural taboo, but you know that it's an experience that they haven't fully perhaps assimilated or processed before they started working on their memoir. And then just the way it sort of plays itself out, the way that they shape it, the way that it's expressed, it just becomes something else. So for me, there was something about that. And there was also something, I didn't include it in the discussion that we had, but it was something that I had talked about with John, where I sort of realized just in terms of my own taste, and I can't say that I'm speaking for Dwight and Parl here, but I did notice that I had a tendency, if a memoir sounded like it was written by a precocious teenager, I was really turned off. But if it was...
names, Jen, please.
If it sounded like it was written by a child or by a grown-up, that was pleasing to me.
Yeah,
I really like that.
There's a recapturing of that younger sense that's really powerful in
there's
some of these
very
books.
little good that happens in the teenage years, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, I figured teenagers are annoying, so there
I
we
don't know.
go.
Okay, just an opposite point of view. The best parts of, I think, Hold Still, which is Sally Mann, the photographer Sally Mann's memoir, a lot of the best parts of that book are her teenage years. And a few other books.
It can be teenage years.
Yeah,
I like the teenage years.
It's the voice.
It's the voice. It's the
Right.
It's whether they process those teenage years or not.
Catch from the Rye, not autofiction we would approve of.
I think it's interesting. There's a tension, too, between, Jen, what you're talking about, which is a kind of rawness, of feeling like something isn't quite processed until the person goes through that process of writing to really understand or recognize something in themselves, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, Paul, you're talking about the quality of the writing, and that's something that's often quite polished and honed and worked on,
Right. I think that they're so linked, that there's something in the work of the memoir that is the work of reseeing, And the language has to be created for the experience. And I think that that's what gives some of these memoirs this kind of, rawness is one word for it, but like you talk about something like fierce attachments and the way that it's electric, those pages, especially those early first few paragraphs. She's trying to create a grammar for this world and for that even act of memory and
Just to interject, you're talking about the Vivian Gornick book, which is number one on this list, which kind of, I think for many readers, will come out of slightly nowhere.
Yeah, so tell us
for
about
those who've read it. Everybody who read it, right where it belongs.
Okay, for those who haven't read us, tell us what this book is and why it is number one, and I think a pretty unanimous number one, ultimately.
Yeah, it's the story of Vivian Gornick and her mother and growing up in the Bronx tenements around the 40s, and that's just the simplest sort of description of what it is. But what the book is actually about is a book about, to some level, what a lot of these books are about. What made me? Where did I come from? What are the sort of great, glorious inheritances? And what do I have to leave behind? What are the sort of roots of the trauma that have shaped me? What are the silences? What are the, so it's a real reckoning with her origins in this way. And it's a real sort of coming-of-age book also in the sense of, how do I escape these people? Should I? Can I? So these are the tensions. As she's describing it, she comes from this world of like an incredibly lonely mother, a lot of suffering, these big brawling community full of just women she didn't want to be. But there's a beautiful scene in the book where she's sort of like, I can't leave. Do I want to leave? What does it mean? So it's a book of, these fierce, ruthless attachments and intimacies. What I think gives this book its particular energy and charge is, for me at least, is how she can look so just cold-bloodedly at herself and all of these women and write about them, sense their limitations, sense their great love. And it just feels like, again, when we're talking about taboos, people can think of, these are books about necessarily shocking events or some kind of explicitness or frankness. But no, sometimes it's just even in the sort of auditing of your own feelings about the people that you think you know best and that love you the most, but this absolute, again, as Jen was saying, this ability to go there, wherever that there is for this particular writer is fully.
I fully agree. Gornick is, I don't think this is original comment, but someone said about this book, like Gornick has a mouth on her, She just has this blunt, quintessentially American voice that just kind of pops into your
very New York voice.
Very New York, very just blunt and direct. And you just know from the word go that she's telling the truth somehow, It's just it's a great feeling.
An outside reader misconception about memoir is that a memoir has to be about someone, even if they're not famous, like they have to have some kind of really interesting, special story to tell. Do you think that's true?
No.
Are we unanimous?
Yeah, we're unanimous.
I wouldn't say that. At the risk of opening a can, I wouldn't say that Gornick's story is particularly special. It's just the story of a woman and her mother and their relationship over the years and all the neuroses involved in that. But, tons of people have that. The fact is that Gornick's just a terrific writer and thinker, and she's funny. She's very lively. This is not just a somber book about inheritances. It's linked by these modern moments where she's walking around the streets of New York with her mother now as an older woman, and her mother's even older. And so it kind of goes back and forth between the past and the present. And she's just so talented that she makes art of it.
One of the things that strikes me from this list is that none of these writers are sort of exclusively memoir writers, that there are a lot of novelists on this list, poets, people who excelled in some other form. And I don't know if you thought about that at all when you were compiling that list.
I mean, it wasn't a consideration. I mean, now that you bring it up, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, is there anybody who is only known
Sally
as a
Mann, but she's a photographer.
But she's
telling stories in some other way. In other words, all of these people are practiced in the art of storytelling.
It is nice to have people with different kinds of life experience on the list. You look at someone like Lars Einar, who wrote this memoir called Travels with Lisbeth, about a period of time when he was homeless on the streets of Austin, Texas, and elsewhere. He travels a bit in the book. Somehow having that really different angle to look at life from is one reason it's on this list. The other reason is it's just so well written. But we didn't want, one thing that I think we all worried about, at least I did a teeny bit about Vivian Gornick being on the list, and believe me, I think this book belongs at number one, was that here we are, 3 book critics picking a memoir by a book critic to be the best memoir of the last 50 years.
And she's not the only book critic on here.
But it's not at all about her becoming a critic, except in the sense it's about her learning to make judgments about her own life and her own feelings. But it's not a book about being a critic in any regard.
But to your question, we don't have serial memoirists on the list.
That's right. That's the thing, I guess, that jumped out.
I don't know if I harbor any prejudices against serial memoirists, but there is something about all of these books that feel carved out of a person.
So for our listeners, just a quick note, we will have this list online, so you're not wondering what it is we're all referencing. But since we're talking about all of the book critics on the list, and we have critics here who know exactly who those people are, who else is on the list in addition to Vivian Gornick, and what are the books?
Margot Jefferson's book, Negroland.
Anatole Boyard, Kafka Was the Rage.
Clive James. Unreliable memoirs.
And I guess he's not just a book critic, but Christopher Hitchens was.
Right.
Christopher Hitchens.
I think that's almost it. We aren't
Tony Judd,
that
historian.
solipsistic, are we?
I think the list, it's funny Jen was saying something about recognizing something after the fact, because when I looked at it, we talked so granularly about a lot of things as we were putting it together, but it is true that at the end of the day, there are a lot of, it's very literary heavy, which I like, but it's a lot of writers who are telling a part of their story, but their primary talent in life is writing. They're not, we have Keith Richards, we have a few others.
Sonali Durrani-Algala.
She was an economist.
The
author of Wave.
Yeah.
Her memoir, Wave, is about this horrific tragedy where she essentially lost her entire family in the tsunami.
And she's an economist, and I think that actually you could see in the book, which was, sorry for the obvious word, but economical in its execution.
The people who I would kind of call, they're not, I wouldn't say they're serial memoirists, but Mary Carr is a poet, obviously, but she's written a few memoirs.
Right, and Clive James has written 5.
And then Russell Baker comes to mind growing up. He wasn't a serial memoirist, but he was sort of a columnist and humorist and journalist, but he was someone who drew on his own life a lot, I think, in his writings.
And growing up, that's a story where there's nothing in particular that happens, but it's such an interesting slice of American life and so well told.
But going back to the critic thing, I don't think it's just our solipsism, which is famous and known, but I think it's also, there's something for me about the way that these people, and I think I said this in our discussion, play with the form and talk about the form and talk back to the form, which keeps it feeling really interesting. And not all of them do this, but somebody like Margot Jefferson is fully always pushing against, do I trust this? Do you trust me as I'm telling you this is true? Let me switch points of view. Write about herself in the third person. She'll change tenses. So it becomes this really interesting act of interrogating memory and what the reader's asked to believe and what we're asking the reader to feel as we're writing a memoir. We want their sympathy and empathy, and she doesn't trust it.
It's interesting when you talk to memoirists, they often talk about that they're writing a character, even though the character is themselves, and they're thinking about it in that same way.
Which is crazy.
And with those layers.
So to have writers actually say, this is absurd that I'm talking, and I'm crafting and I'm imposing a narrative on something that may be, hostile to narrative.
Right.
So
in the early stages of this, one of the biggest anxieties that I think we all had was, are we covering the full territory? I remember very early on in conversations, have we thought about entire continents? Are we thinking about memoirs in translation? Are we considering sort of all the music ones, all the Broadway memoirs, all of the sports memoirs? Did any of you have any kind of particular thing that you were concerned should be in there, couldn't get left out? Because we did leave things out. We started off with hundreds of books on this list.
We talked sports, we talked war. Some of the better books just didn't make it because of the timeline. Others just barely didn't make it for whatever reason.
What barely didn't make it to your mind?
Well, Andre Agassi's memoir, Open, which is a pretty terrific book, ghostwritten, by a terrific writer, J.M. Moringer, whose memoir, some people think should have been on this list as well, The Tender Bar, which was quite a good memoir. He's a very good writer.
We thought about that ghostwriter.
The ghostwriter thing gets into a whole ball of worms.
Yeah, the Keith Richards book, I think, is one of the few on here that has an obvious sort of person who worked with them. But again, it wasn't a strict rule not to have them, but I think we tried to avoid having too many of them. And that might have hurt Agassi in the overall calculus, which got pretty minute toward the end.
I think one thing I was thinking about a lot was, again, as you said, just looking to the rest of the world. And it was just very interesting how the memoir just seems to function in the English-speaking world. It just seems to have this momentum, and it just seems to be there's so many more books to choose from. And it just seems to be, it's like a later form that's coming up in other places, and it's going to evolve in its own particular ways. But I was really surprised that it didn't feel like there were so many ones that we were missing. You know, we were hunting around a lot. A little bit.
I think there's a little bit of sort of still shame around it in France, for example. You know, that we have a book by Emmanuel Carrère, which will be zero surprise to long-time listeners of the podcast. The book is called Lives Other Than My Own. And I don't think that was sold in France as a memoir. I think that it was almost unlabeled, you know, because and that brings up another issue, which is that how much does a memoir have to be about the person, and how much can it be about other people too? That came up with Jesmyn Ward's The Men We Reaped as well, right? Did you have some kind of guideline, or was it just you sort of made that on a title by title basis, made that call?
I think the Carrère was just going to make it in no matter what, because
our next list is 50 best career novels.
Well, it's almost a definition of a good memoir for me. Not always. I mean, every case is different. But one definition for me of a great memoir is that the writer is good at describing the other people they come in contact with in their lives, which is why Mary Karr's The Liars Club is so great, the way he describes her parents, her mother and father. And often the best parts of these memoirs are the people these characters bump into. And if you can't evoke other people really well, your own memoir probably isn't that great to begin with.
There are a number of My Terrible Childhood memoirs on here. I mean, it really is a whole subgenre unto itself. We have
and grief for parents, you know.
What are some of the grief for parents ones?
Patrimony by Philip Roth.
Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. What are we looking for? Parent grief?
Yes.
Well, Wave. Wave is
parent and child.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Margot Jefferson's book, Niggerland, it's not absolutely grieving for her mother, but it really is a lot is
the Jeanette Winterson as well, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, which is the line from her mother.
It's a great title.
Angela's Ashes is another children, miserable childhood.
H is
very
for
well
Hawk by
done.
Helen MacDonald. But parents play a big role in a lot of these books, even if it's not grief. I mean, Patricia Lockwood's Priest Daddy, which is one of my favorite books on this list, is just the portrait of her father in that book is central to it and hysterically funny.
Tell us about that.
Well, her dad is just this, I forget how, she describes him as, at one point, he has Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh on at the same time in the house, and he's walking around in his underwear eating Cheetos, and he plays an electric guitar, and she has this great sort of itemized list of the different horrible sounds that he coaxes from it. You know, there's also a serious examination of him because he was a priest who got a dispensation from the Vatican to have a family, and so the book is a lot about faith eventually and seriousness, but her portrait of the dad, he's just an unforgettable character as if out of a novel.
So there was a lot of process that went into this, rounds of voting and numbers. And John, you did some kind of heroic magic algorithm thing that no one else understood. And probably you don't ever want to have to explain.
It wasn't as complicated as all that.
No one understands complicated.
It can never be replicated.
People. No,
it was based on our facial expressions, emails to him.
All that said, I know that there are some books for which each of you was kind of a passionate advocate, and others that made the list that you were like, this is my book, and you will be forced to acknowledge its greatness. And then others
That's what we do for a living.
Yeah.
you will be forced
just bludgeon
to acknowledge this book's greatness.
People with our opinions.
And then there were others where, you know, you have to back down and you suffered a loss and it's not on here. So I would just like to go one by one. Let's talk first about the book that you just felt like you rallied the team, got it on there. Parl, can we start with you?
book I felt pretty passionate about is Wave by Sonali Dharaniagla. And
all right, I'm going to out myself. I pushed back a little bit against Wave. I reviewed Wave, and I love Wave.
Hugely
I had to be convinced
Wave.
by Parle that it was top 50, however. I had to be convinced, and she convinced me.
I had a powerful
convinced.
ally in Jen Salai to my right
Paul
here.
and Jen were...
How could you not like that book?
No, I reviewed it. I raved about it. I'm just saying, is it in my mind one of the? I mean, this is where it gets difficult. Is it top 50 of the last 50? That's a high bar. That means it's one of the best of an entire year.
Right. So then we have these conversations about trying to parse its greatness and trying to say, it's not just because what happened to her is so defies all comprehension to lose your parents, your husband, your 2 children. In this
You're going to make
thing.
me start crying.
Yeah,
again,
but it's the way that she writes about it. It's the language. It's the way that she fully evokes her anger, her confusion, her grief. It's quite unlike anything I've ever read. And Jen had a very nice line in her write up. She's like, it is like staring into the abyss and feeling that the abyss is going to devour you. This book devours me every time.
I felt like what for me made that book so special was that it was the total fearlessness. She had nothing left to lose.
She had nothing left.
And so she did not hold back. She did not try to beautify her feelings around it. She did not try to come across well. You just felt like there was someone who had nothing left to lose.
Yeah. So, I mean, in one way, when you read this book, you are going to a certain kind of extreme of human experience. But then it's also, at least for me, it was I don't know how she found the language to tell it that is so precise. Again, as you're saying, it's a slim book, but there's not. It's just.
Can you see how convincing that Parle
yeah.
is about this book?
I miss having Parle in the office every day because Parle knows. Parle and I share
a certain passion.
This certain passion, and she'll be like, "This is truly bleak," and hand me something.
And Pamela will say, "Give it to me."
Yes, I need that now.
So yeah, I think Wave is one that, again, it didn't require a huge amount of convincing, but I definitely had to stop and even think for myself, like, again, the other thing we had to think about is that this book works on me also because who I am. It's not just we're reading for other people, but there are books on this list that, I fell in love with years and years ago, and to read them again and to say, does it hold up? Is this a book that I can anoint in this particular way? Like, it may be important to me. It may have been instrumental for me as I was coming up as a reader and as a person, but these kinds of conversations that we had with ourselves and with each other was some of the more interesting conversations I've had.
Jen, did you feel like you pushed for anything in particular?
I mean, not to sound like a broken record, I do feel like the Carrera is a hard sell for anybody who hasn't read it. And so I think that, making the case for a book like that where...
Another tsunami book.
And that's another thing. I mean, we have 2 tsunami books in the top 25.
And we have a surfing memoir.
And we have the surfing memoir.
Barbarian Days by William Finnegan.
Yeah. So I feel like for that book, it was also a book that, as we talked about, it's partly about him, but it's also how he sort of learns more about himself through the experiences of these other people that at the beginning he doesn't even necessarily know that well. I mean, one of them is his partner's sister who's dying. She's a small town judge. And another is her friend, another small town judge. And so he sort of, tells the story of these stories of these lives, and it just becomes something else entirely. And so I feel like for a book like that, it is one of those situations where you just sort of have to tell people, okay, just read it, give it a chance.
Immerse yourself in it.
Yeah. And then, I do feel like it is a book, when it was presented to me, actually, by one of our colleagues, Barry Guin, at the book review, I mean, it took me months to actually read it because it's just hard to make it sound like something, oh my God, I have to read this now. And then you do. And then there's something transformative about it.
Dwight, you had a couple of horses
that
you backed.
I pushed pretty hard for, the Lars Einar Travels with Lisbeth. I pushed pretty hard for Clive James, Unreliable Memoirs. Christopher Hitchens is way up there at number, 6? His memoir, Hitch 22, at 5. And, I just love that book. We can argue all day about Hitchens and his opinions and what he means, but it's just everything is in this book. Just so many opinions and thoughts and feelings and just humor and wit. And it's just a big, bumpy life. And it brings me joy to read that book. So I'm glad to see it up there. Books that I love and I could almost have seen personally in the top 5 or 10 include Joyce Johnson's Minor Characters, which is down in the second half of the list. I revere that book. 2 books that didn't make it that I love are, high and low. High would be, I think, John Updike's memoirs, Self-Consciousness. It's a book that I really admire. And it was hard for us to choose. We had, these sort of great white male, and we had Roth and Vidal and Coetzee, and trying to sort of work out which of these were the best, the very best. I do love The Updike. And there's a smaller book, which it's just one of my favorite books, called On Fire by a Mississippi fireman named Larry Brown, who became a novelist. And it's just a book that I've read several times and find deeply winning. But it's not, that's the hard thing. Is it top 50? Fives, that's a hard bar.
Dwight kept asking that in all our conversations. Yeah. He was the one who always just kind of metaphysically said, but top 50 in the last 50 years?
Yes, questioning it. John, what about you?
Me, I wasn't an official selector, but I think I...
But you had opinions.
Yes.
No.
John was very influential. You were the Phil Spector of this production.
Oh, my God. Boy. Wow.
I'm losing my hair, so that's an especially poignant comment.
Don't shoot anyone.
Wow.
I think the thing that I probably sounded like I would be most unhappy if it didn't make the list was Priest Daddy. It's a book that I think even I acknowledge that there are a lot of things that memoirs do that it doesn't do, and that if people go to memoirs for certain things, they might finish it and go, you know what, it wasn't exactly what I was expecting from a memoir. But it's just, she is such a wickedly talented writer. She is so funny. It's one of the funniest books I've ever read on a very short list.
It is really funny.
And it also introduces like a different register into the list. And I think so much when we're looking at the balance of the list, it really wasn't us sitting around with checklists saying, okay, where's somebody from Asia? Where's the woman here? Where's the politician? I think, again, speaking for myself, what it felt like was more like we were like, okay, here's a memoir that's like a small sliver of a life. Where is the memoir that's a big, capacious sense of a life fully lived with all kinds of incident? Where is the memoir that has a certain kind of sardonic, zany tone? Where's something more like that's the kind of thing I think we started to really think about, was just sort of, these particular arenas.
Pamela, what about you? What did you force on us?
I didn't force anything. You guys, there were enough opinions amongst yourselves. But the ones I think that I was really happy to see on here, there were a few. I love memoirs that sort of play with the kind of slippery nature of memoir itself. So Palimpsest by Gore Vidal and Unreliable Memoirs by Clive James were two I was really happy to see. And actually, there's a lot of humor, especially in the Clive James. I mean, you can't get through the first 10 pages without laughing out loud. Also, a lot of humor in Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, which is one of my favorite books. And I think one of two graphic novel memoirs on this list. I was really happy to see her. I cannot think of, the street peddler selling bootleg cassettes of Yikel Maxon from that book without laughing. And then another one I was happy to see on here was Autobiography of a Face by Lucy Greeley. And Lucy Greeley is a poet also. And after reading that book, I took the only writing class I've ever taken in my life, which is a personal writing class, because she was teaching it, and I wanted to like meet her and be under her influence.
Oh, that's cool. She's also the subject of another memoir that we considered and that people really love, Anne Patchett's Truth and Beauty, which is about her friendship with Greeley.
That's a whole other kind of subgenre, the friendship memoir.
Right. Yes, and Dwight's made the point that Hitch 22 by Christopher Hitchens, among other things, has really great portraits of friendships in it. So I have to,
And so does Experience by Martin Amis.
Yes, a book I love. It's an untidy book, but I love that book. I have to ask something before we run out of time, because I've begged you guys to, one of the things I love about lists is that you are implicitly judging against things also. And I like mixing things up and fighting.
Yeah, no redacted here, guys.
No redacted here. It's only 50 memoirs, so there's no great shame in not being on the list. But there are some very sort of big and beloved books that didn't make it. Pamela mentioned The Glass Castle. That's not on there. Cheryl Strayed's Wild, which I really enjoyed, but didn't make the cut. And maybe in particular, Patti Smith's Just Kids, which some people on social media have already griped about. So I'm just wondering, in your minds, if there are a book or two that didn't make it, and if you could speak to why they're not on the list, even though people might expect them to be.
Well, we did paper, rock, scissors before the show, and Carl lost, so she's going to go first. No, I without naming any, I'm not going to name one of those.
Oh,
titles,
come on!
But maybe I will. Let me dip my toe into the water before I leap in. But there may be a case once or twice on this list where we were trying to find a book that maybe was a little bit lesser known, possibly in one or two cases. I mean, it was nice to have a few surprise titles on here. I think you could make a list of the books that everyone has read and sort of acknowledged books that people love. And again, you get this issue again, like top 50. Like a lot of books that we love dearly, and I can think of some of my favorite novels, my very favorite novels, that I'm not sure I'd put in top 50 of the last, and it's just such a weirdly tight bar. And so I think that was the question that kept coming up for us, at least for me, about a few of these, including some of the ones you just mentioned.
I mean, I've read all of the books that you mentioned and the other books, like, for example, like Dave Eggers, hugely influential books that shaped memoir writing and shaped all kinds of confessional writing. But I think for me, it wasn't so difficult because as much as I read them and I was, moved by them and astonished by them, I feel like when you're making a list of the top 50, these are books that really bear rereading. Like there's something about them that feels either in the telling or, again, the sort of literary aspect that just felt, not that they're going to outlast other ones, but they just felt like they mattered. They felt important. They felt exciting. They felt in lots of ways that they were pushing the form in other different directions or in terms of other intensities. So that's, I think, what I kept coming back to.
All right, Jen, the pressure's on. Name a name, and then
I'll name a name
we'll be all done.
I have to name names. No,
I'll
John
name a
can
couple of
name
names.
John, name the name.
Well, Harl mentioned the Eggers book. I mean, that was a book that when I read it, when it came out, was hugely, I don't even want to say it was important to me personally. It was just very important in the culture, and it felt like something to read it and to kind of, it cracked open something kind of new in terms of that generation's voice. And I think it still does that. And I think there are parts of that book that are still really good and hold up. But I think overall, 20 years after the fact, it's a little baggier. The second half is not, all the real world stuff and MTV.
It feels a little dated at times.
It feels a little dated in a way that it didn't at the time, which is totally fair. That's
I know.
what
I
happens.
hate to think about how millennials read that book. That just,
yeah, it doesn't make us look that
It's like hearing
great.
a song from a certain period. You're like, oh, that drum sound, they liked that. Can you believe that's on that song?
And certain sections of that book are incredible.
The
death of his mother
Eggers
is
can be a terrific. I mean, it's
superb.
Their art. I mean, I love that book, but I don't. Again,
it goes,
top 50.
That book meant a lot to me. But again, I think a lot of it is about what happens. Like Parl said, it's not about the books that at the time did something or were important. It's about, whether 50 years from now they'll still be sort of read on their own terms.
But at the same time, we weren't allergic to that as a factor either. You look at something like The Liars Club, we definitely, or
Angela's Ashes
or This Boy's Life. Like, we did really want to reckon with the books that, defined the genre and to see.
And still held up.
And still hold up. And hold up again to us.
Yes.
To these particular idiosyncratic readers.
Right. And who could be more important than the critics of the New York Times, all of whom are sure to write memoirs someday.
God forbid.
About this podcast.
So quickly again, just to thank you all, Jen Salah, you got away with not naming a book.
They all did.
To be continued.
Yeah.
Dwight Garner.
Come on.
Carl Sagal. John Williams. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
That was our interview with the Jann Wenner biographer Joe Hagan from 2017 and our lively roundtable discussion from 2019 about the best memoirs of the past 50 years. We'll have more from the Book Review Podcast Archive next week. Thank you for listening.